Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Major General Robert H. Scales, Jr., U.S. Army, retired. He is a veteran of Vietnam and a Silver Star recipient. He served over 30 years in the U.S. Army, culminating in a tour as the Commandant of the United States Army War College. He's most recently the author of Yellow Smoke, The Future of Land War for America's Military, and co-author with Williamson Murray of the Iraq War. He is the 2004 Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Lecturer at Berkeley. General Scales, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
And we're going to be joined by Professor Tom Barnes of the History Department, Chairman of the Nimitz Lecture Committee, and also Chairman of Canadian Studies at Berkeley. Tom, welcome.
Thank you very much, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
Actually, I was born into the Army. My father was an engineer officer who graduated from the first OCS class at Fort Belvoir, and basically, since he wasn't a West Pointer, he was relegated to the amphibs, and he went down to Florida to practice with amphibians, where he met my mother, and I was born in Gainesville, Florida, and for the rest of my life, scurried all over the world. I'm 59 years old, and I purchased my first home, my first civilian dwelling 2 years ago.
Oh my goodness. Looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Considerably. My dad was, to use the old Army phrase, a Mustang, in the sense that he was self-educated professional. And I think, if anything, what I learned from him was sort of the ethos and the values of the profession. Because in many professions, if you're not sort of born to the purple, you overcompensate sometimes to be, you know, to sort of mark yourself as a person known for your integrity, and he made sure he passed that on to me, I think. Yeah.
So was it inevitable that you would go into the service?
No, my brother is a lead guitarist in a rock band, so I mean it's not inevitable. But it's very interesting you should ask that question, because I remember even as a young boy I would read history, military history. I read Caesar's Commentaries when I was about 9 years old. I remember I really got interested in that, and I was pretty good at it. The only problem was, when I got to West Point, they expected me to be an engineer, which is why I graduated in the top 5% of the bottom fifth of my class.
And you actually pursued both of these careers, because after Vietnam you went back and got a PhD in history at Duke University, and it's very clear in your writings, which I've gone into, you're very much concerned about history as you think about war as a military strategist. Yeah,
I believe that history is a soldier's laboratory. Thank God we only are able to practice our craft perhaps once in a lifetime. You know, a lawyer, a doctor, a businessman basically stacks up real-world, day-to-day experiences, you know, throughout their lifetimes. We only get a chance to participate maybe once, and so much of our learning has to be second order, has to be derivative. You know, experiential learning is exceptional in our profession, and so that's why soldiers who are serious about their profession have to delve into the historical laboratory. And I understood that from a very early age, and in fact my doctoral dissertation was really a spin-off of my experience in Vietnam. I went through the sort of the card catalog of different pieces of history, and I thought, you know, maybe the British Army at the end of the 19th century is a rough metaphor for what our army was going through at that time, and that's why I did my dissertation. And
what did you learn? I mean, obviously you wrote a dissertation about it, but how did that Vietnam experience change your thinking about, or affect your thinking about where the Army had to go?
That's a great question, Harry, because if I just do a quick sort of side-by-side comparison, what I learned unexpectedly when I wrote my dissertation was that the British Army really was an army that was too busy to learn. That a whole string of practical successes and small wars on the edges of the empire sort of created a sense of anti-intellectualism in the British Army. In other words, doers were revered more than thinkers, and it was the luminosity of your exploits rather than the quality of your work that really counted. And the British tabloids, the Yellow Press, and all that, you know, the penny novels that came out about the Imperial Army really sort of took over Great Britain, and unfortunately by 1914 the Brits had ignored technology, and they found themselves on the short end because then they were facing a first-rate power. Same analogy about the Army in Vietnam was that we were coming out of a war that was a tragic conflict. We were an army that was backing up a pace or two, taking stock, trying to understand what that was all about, and committing ourselves on the course of reform. But there was no analogies out there, and I thought this might have been a good one.
Mm-hmm. You are a military strategist, and I would say after reading Yellow Smoke, not being an expert on the military, but quite a good one, and I would like for you very briefly to tell our audience what a military strategist does / historian, as you do in this book, yeah. Yellow Smoke, which I will show to the camera. I
think what it does is it allows the military to do two things. Number one is to connect the goals of the nation to the ends that the military pursues. You know, one of the interesting analogies of history is the German army was a magnificent army in both world wars at the operational and tactical level, and a terrible failure at the strategic level. And they focused only on how to do it rather than the consequences. And so what a military strategist really does is he ties together the course of the nation with the military, knits those two together at the strategic level of war. And the other thing is a strategist is always the person that you rely on to balance ends and means. We don't bore so deep into the military art that we forget the purpose of armies. It's sort of looking at warfare from a higher perch. And as we all know, looking at the course of great nations go wrong when it comes to national security issues, not because they don't fight the wars well, but they don't fight the right wars. And they tend to overextend themselves and stretch themselves. And those aren't tactical operational errors, those are strategic errors. In other words, you can lose a war like a Sandawana or something like that because you had bad tactics. But you can lose your national destiny if you don't get the strategy right.
Mm-hmm. And ideas in your work are very important.
Right.
Ideas in history. You keep coming back to that. And in addition, technology. Talk a little about that, because I would think that the conventional wisdom is, well, the military isn't about ideas.
That's a very great question. It's all a function of time. If you are boring into the practical present, if your job is to be the can-do guy, the guy who is expected to be the operator, if you will, ideas aren't all that important because you're the fixer. But as you cast yourself out further in time, as you think in time, if you sort of go out a generation or two and look at the course of war, it's all driven by ideas and by vision. Because if you can't, it's sort of like shooting ducks. If you shoot at the duck, your rounds are going to go behind him. But you have to lead the duck, and you lead with ideas and vision. You form an image of what the future is going to look like based on what occurs in the past, and then from that you come up with concepts that you think are about right. In future gazing. You know, Michael Howard once said that, you know, the object of writing writing about warfare and doing future gazing is not to get it right, but to avoid getting it terribly wrong. Mm-hmm. So what we try to do as futurists is to use the tools we have at hand to look to the future and to anticipate what's going to happen, because everything else that follows behind it, building weapons, training soldiers, creating institutions to educate soldiers, all of that are things that travel along the time sequence, but they have to meet up somewhere. And they meet up to where the ideas and vision sort of intersect with the practical day-to-day bits of the military.
And in terms of thinking about war after Vietnam, the tragedy, the mistakes, the war itself became a learning opportunity.
Absolutely.
I mean, not a fault-finding exercise. Talk a little about that, because it's really the case. This morning we had as our guest Robert Cohen, the international relations theorist, and he was saying that confusion is often at the heart of getting to a problem and addressing it with theory.
You know, it's a very interesting question, because armies learn best, those armies that learn best are those armies that lose the war. Mm-hmm. Losing has a way of sort of sharpening the senses. And that's both good news and bad news for our military. But coming out of Vietnam, just like the German army coming out of 1918, went through not only a wrenching sort of cultural redirection, but also intellectual redirection as well. It sort of cleared the decks, and it allowed a whole body of reformers, people like Depew and Starry and Abrams and others, to come along behind and decide to fix it, back to ideas again. Mm-hmm. You know, to form an image of what war would be like, say, in the late 1980s, and then to figure out, you know, the right path to get there. Now, the opposite's also true. Success sometimes breeds complacency. And to use my British analogy again, sometimes success against incompetent enemies doesn't necessarily guarantee success against those who are skilled. And there's a lesson to be drawn from both of those. But it was a period of rebuilding and renaissance in the 70s. And it was probably the last time the American military really went through a process of radical transformation, and the quality of the force that we see in places like Iraq and Afghanistan today are really sort of the legacy of that generation that changed the Army about 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And then the other element, it seems, in this equation, and we're going to in a minute talk about how warfare has changed and what we've learned from the two Iraq wars, that really technology was something that made an amazing difference. Your job as a strategist, it seems, based on reading your book, becomes thinking about history, thinking about the past, thinking about Vietnam, you know, and ideas about wars that, as you say, you know, are the same through time, but then suddenly this new technology which opens up all sorts of opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are three motive forces that change the character of war: technology, domestic politics, and geopolitics, or international politics. And after the Vietnam War, all three variables were in motion. I mean, we had a society that was changing, our place in the world was changing, but every once in a while, perhaps once a generation or perhaps less, some group of technologies suddenly appear over the horizon that really fundamentally changed the nature and character of war. And so in 1973, about that time, particularly the example of the Arab-Israeli War, the Yom Kippur War, demonstrated what the potential of these huge tectonic shifts in technology would sort of seem to bode for the future. And that's when the Army jumped on the technological bandwagon and said, maybe we can partially at least make up for our deficiencies in Vietnam by sort of, you know, embracing these new technologies. And that really was, if there's nothing else that caused the Army to redirect itself, it was a recognition that the technologies of war is forcing change rather than simply an Army deciding to change on its own.
Now, this is interesting because I was very struck by a statement you made before the House Armed Services Committee back in October, in which, and I think it carries on from what you've naturally been talking about, is technology is useful in unconventional warfare.
Absolutely.
But machines alone will never be decisive. The new phase is a struggle in the Iraq War for the allegiance of the Iraqi people, who must choose between two conflicting sides, one represented by the promise of freedom and democracy imposed by an occupying infidel, the other represented by a return to the tyranny and terror of the old regime imposed by fellow Iraqis and Muslims. The tools most useful in this new war are low-tech and manpower intensive.
Right.
So, for all the technology that is forced to change, maybe it is the non-techno world that is now going to be forcing this.
Partially it's because the rest of the world, particularly those who seek to do us harm, see our vulnerability in that area. Remember, Clausewitz says that war is a contest between two opponents, both of whom intend to win. And if you're going to take on the United States, you find the weakness of our society, and that's where you attack us. And clearly, what the first Gulf War demonstrated to Saddam and everyone else in that part of the world is that a contest that's focused on ship for ship, plane for plane, tank for tank isn't going to work. And so perhaps the way to do this is to use the indirect approach, to use sort of the low-tech, non-technical type of approach to find our vulnerabilities and exploit those vulnerabilities. And that's precisely, as I said in my testimony, that's precisely what the enemy is trying to do. But we shouldn't be surprised at that. I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, we can go back thousands of years and see instances where the weaker has always found a way to defeat the stronger, and this clearly is one. What's the lesson? Well, the lesson is that a military force in the future has to balance the technological with the cultural. I mean, there are two ways to approach warfare, and unfortunately, this sense of ahistoricism has crept into the military, I believe, over the last 20 or 25 years because of the opportunities demonstrated by technology. But there's a sort of caste within the military that believes that all of the particular problems faced in warfare can be solved with technology, and I think what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan today clearly shows that that's not the case. The problem that we have as an institution is we have to draw back now, much as we did in '73, and look across this panoply of opportunities and determine where to place our focus. Is it just on the technological solution to the problems, or is it to take a more to take a focus on, say, the cognitive side of preparing and planning for war? And my point in that testimony is it's all about balance. And right now, our future gazing is out of balance, and it's time to bring it back into focus, and what's happening in Iraq is perhaps the catalyst that we need to drive us in that direction. You
actually enumerated in your book, I'll let Tom go again in a second, but I just wanted to go, the U.S. vulnerabilities, and I'll throw your list back at you because it's a pretty comprehensive and a good list. The enemy knows our weaknesses: aversion to casualties, aversion to excessive collateral damage, a sensitivity to domestic and world opinion, and an apparent lack of commitment to prepare for a long-time engagement.
Remember, I wrote that back in the late 90s.
Yeah, but it's very, yeah, you got it. Yeah, I had to throw that back at you. Yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah.
That's right, and again.
So how has it changed?
The change, I think, is driven more than anything else by the nature of those who fight us. You know, one of our problems as a society is our own sort of cultural arrogance when dealing with foreign cultures. Part of it has to do with this sense of ahistoricism and an inability to really truly understand foreign cultures. And those who seek to do us ill have sort of learned all about that. It's very interesting, and an interesting fact which is not in the book, but Saddam Hussein's favorite movie was Black Hawk Down. He made over 3,000 copies of Black Hawk Down and distributed it to all of his senior leaders, thinking this is the way to do it. Because he understood, and he believed, falsely, at least so far, that if you just kill enough Americans, they'll go home. And to your point exactly, oh, by the way, not just to kill Americans, but to kill Americans in such a dramatic and open fashion that the Americans get sick of it and pack up and go home and leave the country, you know, to you. And that's in many ways, I think, what we've seen in both Afghanistan and Iraq is a playback of those factors that I've listed as our vulnerabilities. I mean, we didn't invent that. Those who seek to do us ill are the ones that came up with that list, because they believe that's how you beat the United States.
And they weren't entirely wrong.
Clausewitz is right. Clausewitz is alive and well. And the technologist would tell you, yeah, the technologist would say this: I can take a rock, and through the use of any number of cutting-edge information technologies, I can be able to make the battlefield so transparent and so open that I can see, sense, track, and kill anything that moves about on the battlefield. And the more technology I apply at that, the more clear the battlefield becomes, the more success we'll have, till we get to the point when we absolutely dominate the battle space. Well, the enemy hears that and says, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll just disappear. I'll go into the urban clutter. I'll mix in with the civilian population. I'll attack the Americans with buses, SUVs, and pickups rather than tanks. I'll hide behind the skirts of women and children, and I'll find ways to terrorize and intimidate the local population and force them to provide sustenance for me. And pretty soon, all of the overhead sources on the planet can't look into a crowd in a souk and pick out the insurgent from some teenager, playing in the street. This is nothing new in this. This is as old as war itself. It's just that our obsession with technology has made us a little bit slow in picking up on it.
You're raising a very interesting point, because there seems to be a tension right now between adapting all this new technology to get in there and whip them fast, basically, using soldiers with handheld computers who are communicating with satellites, and orders being given for the launching of a plane from Tampa or whatever. Right. I mean, I'm not a military man, but which is what we seem to have demonstrated we can do quite well in winning. The war, the part of the war that was the battlefield war. But on the other hand, what you're suggesting in your work is that there's a long haul, right. And there's war is the extension of politics by other means, and that in some ways you fail if you don't prepare for the Army or somebody assuming that nation-building, stabilization role after the battle is over.
Actually, that's right. It's not about battles. It's not about campaigns. It's about war. And again, back to Clausewitz again. Clausewitz is very emphatic about that. Success in war is not merely determined by success in a string of battles. You add up those factors, and you don't get success automatically, because wars aren't fought that way. And the second thing is, when I say it's about war, it's about the spectrum of war. People often ask me, well, now that we're transitioning into the peacekeeping phase in Iraq, how is the Army going to change what it's doing? Well, we're not going into the peacekeeping phase of the war. It's just war of a different sort. Mm-hmm. It's Clausewitz's level of war, or Mao's levels of war, where American intervention and manpower and technology have pushed the war down to a lower level. But all of the things that go on today, the opening of schools, creation of elections, finding jobs for the Iraqis, finding ways to pump capital in the economy. Those are just other weapons that are used in fighting the war. It's all about war. And if you ask the insurgents in Iraq, or whoever the enemy is this a war? Are you engaged in war or peacekeeping? They will tell you that this is a war. And if you ask a kid, a young Marine or soldier out walking the beat in downtown Baghdad, whether he's doing peacekeeping, he'll tell you, no, this is a war. So, and it's all part, Harry, of managing expectations. Because if the American people begin to believe that we have transcended war and are now doing something different, all that bodes is expectations exceeding the capability of the force. Mm-hmm. And we'll find ourselves going back to, say, something like the end of the Tet Offensive in 1968, mm-hmm. where the American people were firmly convinced by the American command that the war was over, it was time to do something different, and the North Vietnamese had a different idea. So it's about war, not battles, and war is an extension of a campaign that in many ways can last decades.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important for our audience to distinguish, in a way, the two kinds of soldiers who may be the very same soldier. So that in the battle, the soldier, whether it's a man or a woman, is really almost a person using computers or some of them, not all of them, in new ways, right. to bring down precision weapons, right. to be on the ground and say, over there, fire that precision weapon, right. and so on. So there is a different kind of human quality. That is, it's a person with computer skills, but also a person who has the ability to be responsible at a very decentralized level.
You've hit on it. You've hit on the great conundrum, and it's exactly right. We're trying to, we expect a sort of multifunctionality for our young men and women. And oh, by the way, we don't have time to pull out, like a professional football team, to pull out one team, the passing team, and to throw in the, the running team. It's all one team. And the interesting ironies about what just happened last year was that we went through a 23-day war where precision, speed, knowledge, all of the great components of large-scale warfare were demonstrated terrifically by this force. And then literally the next day, the 10th of April, suddenly they were expected to be in a, to go through a complete personality and function change, you see, and it didn't happen. It happened probably a lot better than I thought it would, but you don't have time to rebuild you don't have time to build a bench. You don't have time to swap out sides. And so warfare in the future is going to demand young men and women of exceptional quality because they have to do both. They have to operate at the high level of war, high-tech level of war, and then literally the next morning wake up and operate at a lower level of war. And this is totally different from those in my generation, what we experienced in Vietnam.
And the second phase really is what we call euphemistically nation building. I mean, in watching, as I told you earlier, my class watched a movie called Beyond Baghdad by Frontline, and it was like voluntarism, at work as soldiers were going out and helping put in infrastructure and meeting with city councils to expose them to
nothing that they'd been trained to do.
Yeah,
nothing. Okay. I asked a division commander, a really good friend and a terrific guy. This would have been in late April. I said, he's commander of one of the most powerful divisions in the world. I said, what do you need? What is it that you're short right now? And he said, interpreters. Reliable interpreters. People who can listen to what an Iraqi says and interpret it in the context of the Western ear. And he said, I feel like we're an army of strangers in the midst of strangers. The inherent goodness of the American soldier doesn't come through because there's this cultural wall or cultural divide between us, and we can't cross it. So a soldier walking on the streets of Baghdad sees a young man across the street, has no idea whether he's there to be greeted or killed. And these same soldiers, not a week before I sent this email, were involved in the high-tech business of killing on large scale, and now all of a sudden you expect them just with the snap of a finger to be someone completely different. That's asking an awful lot of an 18-year-old kid who's earning after taxes about $800 a month.
So you're really suggesting, as a matter of overall American strategy, that if we can't go only in one direction in terms of the resources. We obviously have to fund the military for the weapons and the technology and the training it needs. But on the other hand, we seem to have a responsibility to do the training in history and language and knowledge of regions and so on and so forth if we're going to address adequately the second phase of the war.
You have to think of it as a balance between two types of transformation. Technological transformation and a cultural cognitive transformation. And they have to be applied in balance. They have to be applied in synergy, if you will. Because if you have a high-tech instrument that's able to kill with great precision from great distances, and you're not able to go into a civilian population and to find and anticipate and to discriminate about what to strike, then this does you no good. You have this huge sledgehammer, but you have no way to find out where the nails are. And my view, at least, as I've said in these works, is that we've been too technocentric and not cultural-centric over the last 20 or 25 years. And oh, by the way, our enemies have figured this out. So this is not an imperative that we need to do on our own. It's a reaction to how our enemies have changed their method of fighting. It's tit for tat. It's action-reaction. It's adapt or die. And my thought is that while the money that's spent on technology is important, now it's time to start spending money on this other softer side of transformation.
You have a sentence in, I think it's in the introduction of the Yellow Smoke book, which I thought was quite compelling, and I'm going to read and have you deconstruct it, as we say in the university. You said this, the long-term goal, the abilities to command indirectly and to operate independently for long periods on dispersed battlefields located in distant and hostile regions are qualities that will be in demand in both stability operations and shooting wars. So the ability to command indirectly, suggests that the commanders of the overall operation are going to have to defer to people on the battlefield.
Harry, remember, you asked me here, and I'm a historian.
Yeah, right.
So you're going to get some history.
Yeah, that's fine. Please.
Let me give you some history. Yeah. If you visit the Battle of Gettysburg,
yes.
And you see a corps front, a corps was commanded by a two-star general. You see a corps front. It's about 1,000 yards wide, and in that 1,000 yards there may be 3,000 or 4,000 soldiers. So a corps commander was a direct commander. He would see things that were unfolding in front of him, and he had time to plug holes, to move soldiers around, and he could command with his voice, either by sending messengers over to, or pat a soldier on the shoulder, or if necessary, get out in front of his formation and command that. So it was a can-do, go-to sort of guy. If you were to go to Gettysburg today and array a force like we're using, for instance, in Afghanistan, on that same 4-mile by 2-mile square piece of terrain, the senior American president's probably a staff sergeant. And yet the piece of terrain that he's commanding is a piece of terrain that he can't command directly. So instead of patting someone on the shoulder or reacting to stimulus that he sees in front of him, he's got to demonstrate a different set of skills. He's got to think in time. He's got to anticipate. He has to lead soldiers he can't see or touch, either through the use of his voice or through the use of the written word. In other words, we're asking soldiers to demonstrate skills that 148 years ago were expected from two-star generals with 35 years in the Army, now to be demonstrated by staff sergeants with 6 or 7 years of service. And oh, by the way, it's very interesting to note that in this age of precision weaponry, a staff sergeant can make a catastrophic strategic decision with great precision. In other words, he can direct a 2,000-pound bomb into an Iraqi school just as easily as he could into an Iraqi Republican Guard position. You see the problem. So suddenly, those at the lowest ranks in our military are charged quite often with strategic level responsibilities and the responsibility, as I say in this piece, to think in time. And what makes it even more complex, of course, is that these same soldiers now are expected on the one hand to think in time and lead indirectly in actual combat, and then turn around the next day and lead indirectly and operate autonomously when they're trying to build a school, or they're trying to establish rapport with a local tribal leader, or they're trying to build a hospital. Can you imagine the burden that puts on our young men and women? Can you appreciate how difficult that is? And unfortunately, as I said, our own sort of latent sense of ahistoricism in our military has sort of impeded our ability to develop indirect leaders at the level that we have people leading indirectly today. So I think what I wrote, when I wrote that a couple of years ago, I had a sense that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. Because that same battlefield, that 2-mile by 4-mile square piece of Afghanistan, may in the future be commanded by a buck sergeant or a private. And we'll be asking him to make life and death decisions with strategic consequences. And yet we do very little right now to train him to do that. And that, I think, speaks very well to sort of the intuitive, innate sense of our young men and women. The fact that we come from a society that values individualism. And I don't think any other army in the world, with the possible exception of Great Britain, could generate competencies that quickly at that young of an age, where young Americans don't wait to be told what to do, and they use their own intuition to make decisions. That's something I would believe is uniquely American.
In one of your books, you're talking about one of the first uses of this new technology, and that the young people, that is the soldiers out in the field, would accept the icon as a reality, because they were used to computer games and whatnot, whereas there was still a debate among the command structure. Well, you know, is that really going on where the icons?
It's believing the icons.
Yeah.
You know, my generation was, you get an intelligence report and you send out a scout or an airplane to verify it. Mm-hmm. You want to make sure that you have ground truth, and the only way you're going to be convinced that you have ground truth is to have somebody see the object. Yes, it's there. But this younger generation trusts the icons. Mm-hmm. They're able to intuitively determine whether the icon is telling the truth or not. So they don't need to go back and do the verification. And so the old linear process of the 5-paragraph field order and the process of military decision making has been turned on its head. Mm-hmm. It's like playing a video game. I see something, I react to it intuitively. Mm-hmm. I don't have to have someone else to tell me what truth looks like. And
it's about maneuver, is what you're saying, and not the old formations, the old lines, and so on.
You have to view it, you know, someone said, well, what's it like, using a sports analogy? I said, well, the old war is like a football game. New war is like a soccer game, or maybe rugby, where all throughout the field things are in motion, and the concentration point can shift from one end to the other very quickly, and that there is no quarterback. I mean, there's control, but there's not linear control. And what our young people are beginning to learn is that they have to saddle responsibility for making decisions in this new battlefield, because it's nonlinear. It's almost like seeing war as a series of ink blots. You know, war that's fought for control of territory rather than the capture of specific points. It's diffuse, it's decentralized, it's nonlinear, it's three-dimensional. All of those things are occurring right now. We see it happening in Iraq today. Again, add another layer of complexity to what wars are all about today.
Bob, I want to take you back to Hamburger Hill. Young captain, 105 millimeter howitzers, 101st Airborne Division. I forget what the Vietnamese name,
Dong Ap Bia.
On Bien, yes. Mm-hmm. Another way of looking at war, in a more immediate and personal way. You've been Deputy Chief of Staff of TRADOC, Training and Doctrine Command of the Army. Mm-hmm. You've been Commandant of the War College at Carlisle Barracks, which must be about the most prestigious academic job there is in the military, actually. Yeah. But all of that sort of, in a way, it seems to me, goes back to the whole question of what you experienced in NAM. Mm-hmm. And without prying too closely, you've used the term more than once in the last 24 hours. We've been in contact quite a bit with each other, of irony. You see irony in these things. I'm sure you read Paul Fussel's book.
Sure.
I think that probably has had an enormous impact on all of us. Yeah. How did Hamburger Hill make all of this? Were there any epiphanies?
Yeah, there were. There were.
We should explain what you're referring to. Yeah. So this is your
experience in NAM.
In Vietnam. Right. Describe that tour. Before you tell us what you learned from it, let us inform our audience exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, I was the direct support battery commander. That is, I commanded the battery that supported the infantry battalions that made the charge up and subsequent operations. We continued that battle through, I guess, from what, May until late June 1969. It was a long, but most people think of it only an 11-day. No, this thing went on for 2 or 3 months. And it was an attempt by the 101st Airborne Division to control the routes of entry from Cambodia off the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the arteries that led into Hue and so forth. So it was a key battle, and it was fought very tenaciously because the NVA regiments that were there were very good. The 29th Regiment, of course, comes to mind. They were very professional and very dedicated, hard soldiers. I learned a couple of things. One is that I remember sitting there in my battery and shooting, I think I told you this, 1,100 rounds a day at that hill. 1,100 rounds. I used to watch 100 sorties go in a day under that hill. This is even after the main assault. This is as late as June 1969. I could see that hill denuded because of the incredibly powerful American firepower. And at night, you'd see the cooking fires come out. for the enemy. You'd see the vehicles draw up to resupply. You'd have these sensors where you could hear the Vietnamese chatting, playing cards, you know, catching a little fresh air before they went back in their bunkers, and the whole routine started again the next morning. And so from that I sort of said, even though I'm a purveyor of firepower at the time, I said, you know, there's got to be more here than just this American fixation on firepower. There's got to be another dimension to this war that perhaps we need to learn. The other thing I guess I learned was, to your point about irony, is that warfare, once you unleash the dogs of war, the consequences are always unpredictable. You know, what started off as a sort of routine assault on a mountaintop turned into a huge international imbroglio that went from France to Britain to the United States, the halls of Congress and so forth. And I thought to myself, my God, just that little bitty hill is probably going to change the course of this war. And it did. And so minor actions oftentimes have huge unforeseen consequences, to my point about irony. And I guess the last thing that struck me about the thing is the enormous tenacity of the American soldier when he's sort of put in these situations. There was really no reason viscerally for the soldiers to do the things they did. And it made me think, frankly, as I've told you, Tom, it made me think, what makes people do this? What are the motives? Is it money? No. Is it the commander? No. Is it national pride? I don't think so. And many of the soldiers that came back from those assaults came back, you know, really disenchanted, you know, complaining about, you know, this is a terrible thing. This is, you know, we shouldn't, you know, I don't know why we're doing this. And yet, when you put a rifle in their hands and you put them back on the hill, they did it again. So back to your sense of irony. What is there about the human character that has them take risks that the normal 22, 23-year-old kid would not do? And I found that to be intriguing, and that kind of is the sort of thing that's going to form the nexus of the next work that I'm writing on.
Is war a default position in our society?
You know, it's funny. During Vietnam, peace was the default position. Today, interestingly enough, I believe war is the default position, because it's the difference between a forest fire and a prairie fire. You know, a prairie fire will last for weeks, and you can't put it out simply by stamping on the fires. Forest fire is on, it's over. And I think what we see is a new style of warfare, not driven by us, but driven by those who seek to do us ill. They realize that they can't fight another Vietnam with us, and they realize they can't fight another war in Central Europe. So the way to beat the Americans is to turn our short wars into long wars, to take wars of intervention and turn them into wars of attrition, to play to what they view as the lack of will and tenacity on the part of not the American army, but the American people, to play to the press, if you will. And this is part of the inheritance that we had from Hamburger Hill and other subsequent wars that we fought. After a while, the enemy gets it. They learn how to beat the Americans at their game, not the American game. It's very interesting to note that since 1948, armies in the region are 0-7 against the Israelis in the United States in open, conventional, high-tech warfare. They're 5-0-1 against the United States in unconventional warfare. The lessons are there.
And what does it take to create a broader public consciousness of this complexity? Because what you're saying is that if you separate this out and say there's a war, a battle, it's over, and that's it, in a limited time frame, and then we're out of there, that you're not going to win the war.
Yeah. Well, two things. Number one is, because of the nature of the American people and the nature of our society, perhaps more than any other great power in history, America has to choose its wars very carefully. You know, Wellington once said that to a great power there's no such thing as a small war. That certainly applies to us.
And Frederick the Great said that if you defend everything, you defend nothing.
You defend nothing, exactly. So one thing that this country has to do apropos to your question, is take appetite suppression pills when it comes to picking when it comes to picking the next fight.
Yeah, right.
No, really, because inevitably, first of all, the United States can't lose a small war.
No.
You know, if it's Pakistan versus India in Kashmir, that's one thing. That's a small war. It's been festering for years. But if it's the United States in fill in the blanks, Beirut, Mogadishu, Vietnam, Panama, the Gulf, then it may seem lopsided. It may seem almost strategically inconsequential. And in terms of, say, drain on gross national product, it may not even appear as a blip on the screen. But internationally, when America gets involved in violence, international violence, it's very important. It's very strategic. And how we perform in one then determines our success in the next. It's sort of like drawing credit off of a bank. If you establish your will and your tenacity to stick with it and to prevail, then that makes the next time we do this easier, because our enemies understand that the perception of Americans lacking will isn't true. So each experience plays on the other. My point to you about Saddam's favorite movie. Yeah. It was his favorite movie because the light went on when he saw that movie and says the way you beat Americans is just to kill them. And that's what we're going to do.
I guess what I want you to comment on is this dilemma, which is that you've laid out what the military can do with the technology, with new training for its soldiers, with new understandings of the command structure, as a mobile, lean, mean force that goes in and deals with a rogue or a failed state or so on. But the other side of this is what we do after we've gone in and won the battle. And here we get into American values, and the way we mobilize support is by saying, well, we're going to remake these places. We're going to turn them into democracies. And there is this tension, and just superficially, I would say, the one can see, you know, the battlefield military adopting, you know, some of the ideas you're putting here, adopting the technology, you know, it's a go. But on the other hand, the problem of the long haul, you know, the nation building, and I'm not here talking about what the soldiers can do. I'm willing to accept that. What I'm talking about is a long-term American commitment to the difficult tasks that is involved, and staying there for the long term to do what we might do.
I think you have to view this American involvement in small wars as a great power divided into two sort of periods. There's the pre-911 and the post-911. One of the things I find interesting in writing my second book, the first one I wrote before 911, in writing the second was this...
we should show the Iraq War.
That's it, yeah. The Iraq War. What I noticed was a tectonic shift in the attitudes of Americans about sticking with it, the tenacity. Many reasons for it. Even if there is no strategic connection, say, between 911 and some other conflict, in the minds of Americans, they view today foreign involvements as directly connected to their own welfare, whereas in Vietnam they didn't. It was truly a foreign war against an unknown enemy. Today, partially thanks to the information revolution and the availability of combat scenes from the theater, the American people, I think, feel a closer connection to other regions of the world, and they have about them a sense that this affects their daily lives, and so that certainly increases sort of the social resolve to press on. Now, having said that, clearly over time, if progress isn't made, if society that we're trying to remake isn't remade, or God forbid collapses, then of course attitudes will change. But I was more struck with the patience of the American people after the invasion of Iraq, not so much with the dissent that I see, and I really attribute that to 911. If we'd have tried to do this in 1973, it would have been a completely different thing. We'd probably not have done it in the first place, but I think the American people are really starting to become more and more sort of focused internationally. Not so much because they're interested in other cultures, but so much as they're interested in their own welfare, and they see the connection between the two.
You know, you were speaking of reform, you said about 30 years ago. We had one set of reforms that came in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Now we are in the cutting edge for the next set of reforms. It's very funny, American history as a whole, you've probably noticed this, our reforms come, military reforms come about once every generation.
Once a generation.
About every 30 years.
Exactly.
And you can take this back certainly as far as the War of 1812.
Sure.
And the War of 1812 doesn't do so badly with respect to the War of the American Revolution.
You could argue that the Army's mobility revolution occurred with the atom bomb.
That's right.
That suddenly the Army woke up and said, we can't have this huge beached whale, and we have to start the process of becoming maneuver oriented. That really began a generation before, and it started again. And I think we're starting this next generational shift. You could say that with the end of the era of machine warfare, with the last of the great armored battles over, it's time to think in terms of a generation of information warfare, where your principal advantage is your ability to know the enemy. And that's why, to my mind, this cultural transformation is so important. I mean, if we're just going in with a sledgehammer, if we're going to bludgeon the enemy, then this sense of cultural sensitivity probably isn't important. I mean, we didn't know a lot about German culture when we rolled across the plains of northern France and Germany. We were there to crush Nazism. But now it's a war fought with rapiers, not sledgehammers. And so you do need this subtle sense of the cultural aspects of warfare in order to be able to wield your power with great discretion and great discrimination surgically. And again, America has no challenge in striking a target with great precision. It does have a challenge in striking the right target at the right time to the right end. And that's why I think this whole process of cultural transformation is so important.
So it should be cheaper, too.
Absolutely.
I mean, okay,
and
so in other words, 23%, the Army's share of the Pentagon's budget, every year for how long has it been now? For a generation at least. We don't have to increase that at all.
And you have to ask yourself, who's doing the heavy lifting here.
Well, the Army's doing that.
Of course they are. Well, the Army and the Marine Corps. But if you believe in the old 3-to-1 rotation scheme, where you need three units in order to keep one forward deployed, and we're in this forward deploy scheme because we're in a war, not a battle. Right now, the price tag is 20 brigades: 2 in Korea, 2 in Afghanistan, 16 in Iraq. That means the requirement is for 60 brigades, 3 in 1. The Army's only got 33. It doesn't take a mathematical genius to figure out that you can't do that for very long. Now, the ships have gone home, the aircraft are back in their hangars in the United States, but the same very small, thin red line is over there doing these sorts of things. So you ask, is the Army overstretched? Well, of course it is. The math alone dictates the Army's overstretched. Do you need to do something to fix it? Absolutely. You either need to change your ends, or you need to increase, change your appetite, I guess, for intervention, or you need to increase the size of the force, or you need to get someone else to do it for you. Those are your 3 options.
What are we going to do?
I think a little of both, all 3. First of all, we're going to have to, I say we, the United States over the decades ahead is going to have to do a better job of defining our national interests. We have to do a better job of defining where America's security perimeter actually, where it exists. What's important, what's not important. There's an old Army saying, it goes back many years, and it goes like this: the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Concentrate, concentrate, concentrate. It's economy of force and mass are the 2 principles that are most operative in this war. You have to take risk and ignore certain regions of the world that don't threaten the vital interests of the United States, and concentrate on those who do. That's the first thing. Secondly, other people need to help us out. I mean, every great power that was the world superpower at one time or another fought with allies through coalitions. Oftentimes they were pickup teams, but still, no nation can police the world on its own. And I think the other thing is, frankly, we're going to have to readjust our military forces to better reflect the realities of the world today. Much of our military is nothing more than a Cold War leftover. But we're not fighting the Russians anymore. We're fighting a different type of war. I mean, we optimized the military to fight a huge mass army for a short period of time. Now we have to fight a diffuse enemy over a long period of time. So, focusing on the enemy and his capabilities won't work anymore. We have to be able to maintain an army that has legs. and is able to stretch ourselves into the future. And, oh, by the way, do it without breaking the bank.
Mm-hmm. One final question requiring a brief answer, and that is, how would you advise students to prepare for the future if they see the military in their career, either as a soldier or as a strategist?
War is a thinking man's game. The intellectual is to the physical as 3 is to 1. The surest way to be successful in this business is to study your profession. By that, I don't mean to cram for exams. I mean long-term, reflective study on your profession. Visit the laboratory. If you're a physicist, you go to the laboratory to refine your theories. If you're a soldier, you go to the library to refine your theories. Study your profession and understand not second and third order effects of what you're about to do. So when you finally go out to practice it, you're not learning to fight by fighting. You've already fought this battle 10,000 times in your mind, and you'll be better at it.
Bob, on that note for the future, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to visit our program as you're giving the Nimitz lecture on campus. And
Thanks
Tom,
a lot, Bob.
and thank you very much, Tom, for joining us today. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.